Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the March on Washington panel. What does the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom mean for today? My name is Tanisha Armstrong, and I'm the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project at Stanford. Before I introduce this morning's panel and participants, I want to take this opportunity to tell you about relevant research being conducted at the King Papers Project by dedicated and talented staff, consisting of Assistant Editor David Lyme. David, would you stand, please? And research assistants Megan Weaver and Judy Raymond, who work with me to publish the papers of Martin Luther King and bring King's legacy to future generations. The King Papers Project was founded in 1985 by Coretta Scott King. Its principal mission is to publish the authoritative 14-volume edition of Dr. King's most historically significant speeches, sermons, correspondence, and unpublished manuscripts. With the help of Stanford undergraduates, we have published 7 critically acclaimed volumes and are close to submitting the 8th volume to our publisher. The 7 already published volumes have become essential reference works for researchers and have influenced scholarship about King and the movements he inspired. One historian said of the volumes, and I quote, "An hour spent with a volume in this series is virtually equivalent to a conversation with Martin Luther King Jr." End quote. Volume 8 will chronicle the period from September 1962 through December 1963 and will include approximately 130 fully annotated documents. Thematically, Volume 8 will cover the 1962 integration of Ole Miss, King's relationship with President Kennedy and his administration, alleged communist infiltration of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as the FBI's electronic surveillance of King, King's participation in the campaign to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama, his I Have a Dream speech at the August 1963 March on Washington, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and Kennedy's November 1963 assassination. In addition to the well-known King writings and speeches from 1963, such as the I Have a Dream speech and letter from a Birmingham jail, Volume 8 will also include many never-before-published documents, such as King and Coretta Scott King's March 1963 statement expressing disappointment that their 5-year-old son, Martin III, was denied entry into London Episcopal Day School because he was Black, and despite the school having a non-discriminatory admissions policy. We are also publishing King's 9 June 1963 interview on the David Susskind Show, where King talks in depth and at length about the Birmingham campaign and criticizes the Kennedy administration's hesitancy to make a moral appeal for civil rights. Slide, please. Another noteworthy document that we are publishing in Volume 8 is King's March on Washington program, with a note scrawled in the corner from King's lawyer and speechwriter, Clarence B. Jones, notifying him that African-American scholar and co-founder of the NAACP, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who had immigrated to Ghana and joined the Communist Party, had died. The note reads, "Dear Martin, just learned that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois died last night in Ghana. Someone should make note of that fact." Although the note was passed to King, Ossie Davis, actor and activist and chairman of a cultural program for the March on Washington, announced Du Bois's death to the march attendees. Now to introduce the panel of participants, what does the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom mean for today? In 2018, Jonathan Greenberg co-founded the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. Prior to joining USF, Jonathan Greenberg has taught negotiation, conflict resolution, international law at Stanford Law School, and has published work on Kingian nonviolence, human rights, and environmental history. Dr. Aisha Hardaway is a professor of law, co-director of the Social Justice Institute, and the director of the Social Justice Law Center at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Hardaway's research and publications include the intersection of race and the law, criminal law, and civil litigation. And last but not least, Dr. William Jones is a professor in the Department of History and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Jones is the author of The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. and the tribe of Black Ulysses, African-American lumber workers in the James Brown. Please help me welcome the distinguished group of panelists of these scholars.
I want to thank Tanisha for the wonderful introduction. Dr. Laura Martin, bringing us here. I do feel honored to be here. Washington. I'm trying to figure out how to be as succinct as possible. I think that the March on Washington represents an extraordinary and powerful achievement. Looking back 60 years later, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by backlash and evisceration of gains. That's my main theme. I want to speak personally at the beginning. About 10 years ago, I went to the South for the first time. I'm from California, LA. I lived in the East Coast, came back here. I went on a trip called Sojourns of the Past, visiting major civil rights places. I was on a bus with Minnie Jean Brown, the whole time talking with her. We went to Memphis, we went to Little Rock, and we went to Birmingham, Alabama. We met with the parents of one of the girls who was murdered at the church. We sat in the church, many of you have been there. And 1963 was the present. It had not gone away. And I was shaken by that experience. Prior to that, my focus was on international conflict resolution, and particularly the legacies of communal violence and the repeated trauma in places like Israel, Palestine. But when I came home, I realized that I wanted to focus on the same problems that we have in this country. And through pure serendipity, Dr. Clarence Jones was here at the scholar in residence at the Martin Luther King Institute. And through a blessing that you can't explain, we became very close. We taught together, wrote together, and we founded together the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice that I now lead. And 1963 was very, very personal for Dr. Jones. I tried to get him to come here, he's 92, but I think it was too hard to do. But just to tell you some of the things, he was with Dr. King and the advisors when they planned Project C for Confrontation, the Birmingham March. He was with Dr. King in the Gaston Motel when he was deciding whether to violate the court order. He was the only person allowed in the prison cell when Dr. King was writing the letter, and many of you know the story. He was scribbling everything, and Dr. Jones thought he was insane because they had more pressing problems. How are we going to pay the bail for everybody? Then he went with Harry Belafonte to get $100,000 from the Rockefellers in the basement of Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. He was given a promissory note, and he called Harry Belafonte afterwards. He said, I've got $100,000 in a briefcase, which is a huge amount of money in our time. I had to sign a promissory note, which means they can call me up and I got to pay them back. And Harry Belafonte said, better you than me. A week later, someone came from Chase and gave him a note waiving that. But that's the reason why in the March on Washington, Dr. King talks about the promissory note. It came from that metaphor, And Dr. Jones wrote the first 7 or 8 paragraphs of that speech, which was something he didn't even know he was going to actually use. So also, Dr. Jones was in Birmingham negotiating with Burke Marshall the resolution of the agreement. So 1963 is alive for Dr. Jones, and I've had the blessing to be able to be close to him, and that's answering Dr. Martin's question, you know, that's my main source. That's what I've learned from. And one other small point, so Tanisha Armstrong showed that note about W.E.B. Du Bois. Years later, 50 years later, whatever it was, 45 years later, when Dr. Jones came to the Martin Luther King Institute here, he had the opportunity to look in the files, and he said, "Do you have anything from the March on Washington?" He said, "Well, yeah, we do." So he opened up a file and he found that document, and he started crying. He had no idea that that document still existed. Dr. King put it in his shirt pocket, it went home, Coretta collected it at some point, put it in a box, it ended up at our Stanford Institute. So this is personal, and you know, I was talking to Jonathan, Dr. Jones and Andrew Young are really the only 2 people still alive who were in the inner circle. There's many other important people, James Lawson and Bernard Lafayette and Gypsy Jackson, but in the inner circle. So we're really we're at the very end of that period where we have the opportunity to be with the people who were in that close inner circle. So I also want to say, something, and I know, I'm sorry, a little time, but you know, Dr. King he used the metaphor of a world house, that we come from different faiths, different backgrounds, but we all inherited a house, and we have to live in that house and find a way to live in that house. And Clarence said when he was at the March on Washington, the person who made the biggest impact on him, other than Martin Luther King, was Rabbi Yaakov Prince, who was the rabbi of the Berlin Jewish community. And he, as you probably know, he said that bigotry and discrimination are not the worst problem facing humanity. The worst problem facing humanity is silence. So I feel like we are in one of the worst, most horrible times in world history since 1963, since the end of the World War II, this week. And I believe we have an obligation not to be silent. But what is that obligation? We have an obligation, I think, to remember the core values of the March on Washington and the Black Freedom Movement, which were to affirm the humanity of every person and to not let anyone denigrate any other person. So with that introduction, I want to talk about the theme today, and I want to talk about history, vision, and policy. Now, I'm already halfway done, and I haven't. Let's see. Hold on a second. I'm so sorry, but let me go as fast as I can. So, you know, Clarence believes this quotation is the central vision of the Black Freedom Movement and Dr. King and the March on Washington. And I want to talk about this, about what were the demands of the March on Washington. The first thing I want to say is that the March on Washington situated the Black freedom struggle, which had mostly in the prior decade been local campaigns, into a national struggle situated in the entire arc of American history, going back to the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. That's the promissory note. And of course, it was precisely 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And we were talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, the arc of American history is what Dr. King talked about, the schizophrenia of America where there's these values of human rights and dignity and citizenship, and then there's white supremacy crushing it, so, and the swings. So, W.E.B. Du Bois, talked about the slave went free and stood a brief moment in the sun and then moved back again towards slavery. So we had the second founding, as Eric Foner calls it, and then we had almost another 100 years of Jim Crow, apartheid terror, disenfranchisement. So King asked Dr. Jones King asked Dr. Jones to draft a second Emancipation Proclamation. And Dr. Jones met with a whole team of lawyers in New York over a period of weeks or months, and they drafted something called the Second Emancipation Proclamation. And King brought it to JFK in the White House and said, issue this. This is a unique moment to honor the 100th year anniversary by demanding the end of segregation. And JFK said no. So that led, of course, the vision of the March on Washington. How radical was it? So, famously, with his lacerating wit, Malcolm X called it the farce on Washington and said that JFK should get an Academy Award or multiple Academy Awards for his direction of the spectacle. Well, I think that's wrong, and we've talked about why. And then I believe that the vision of the march was radical and revolutionary. Dr. King, emphasizes and praises the marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community. And if you look at A. Philip Randolph, he talks about, we are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. And what do we want? We want a free, democratic society dedicated to the political, economic, and social advancement of man along moral lines. I mean, this is an unbelievably big framework for what his vision was. And by the way, I know a lot about the march also from an excellent book by William Jones, who's going to talk here. And I think he's going to talk a little bit about the long history that led to the march. And then we also, interestingly, 4 years later, King spoke at Riverside Church in words that echoed so strongly what Randolph was saying in 1963. And then John Lewis, we talked yesterday, I'm glad we had a chance. John Lewis, of course, everyone knows, was forced to edit his speech because it was inflaming some people, particularly the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, and they negotiated it. But it still was talking about a great revolution in our country. By the force of our demands, our determination, and our numbers, we shall splinter the segregated South into 1,000 pieces and put them together in the image of God and democracy. So did that take place? We talked about, again, Dr. King, the whirlwinds of revolt will shake the foundations of our nation. So, now, 2023, we see the image of God and democracy completely perverted. We see a merger of religious faith, and I hate, this is not
Didn't do it, brother. I didn't do it.
That was a little jostle. I never knew you were.
I urge everyone to read Dr. Martin's wonderful book, because this is not new, what's happening now. But what J. Edgar Hoover was doing top down has become this populist movement that has incredible power in our country, unfortunately. Unfortunately. This merger of anti-democratic, evangelical, white Christian nationalism. So, you know, this vision that we had that we're gonna merge God and democracy is coming to fruition in the most perverted and ugly way. We have to fight it, okay? Okay, policy, and I wanna end shortly. I passed around the actual, you can see the program, and you can see this demands. There were specific demands, like Frederick Douglass said. You know, it was about jobs and freedom. And if you look here on the second page, they say this is a at the March on Washington is a living petition in the flesh. So they had a big vision, but they had very specific policy demands. Okay? And I don't have time to go through this list, but I want to, you know, the main theme is the achievement of most of these demands was extremely significant during the Johnson War on Poverty and Great Society that happened because of the pressure of the Black Freedom Movement. And then, starting around the Reagan Revolution, most of them were eviscerated or weakened very severely. And I want to, you know, we can talk about each of them. Voting rights, you know, you had this incredible achievement in 1965, and only recently with the Roberts Court has that been significantly undermined, and we can talk about that if you want. But I do want to talk, just to conclude, way more than I can do, but let me talk about this, okay? Let me conclude. Look at number 8. We demand, and you know, A. Philip Randolph at the end, the last speech was not Martin Luther King. We all think that was the last speech, it was not. A. Philip Randolph got up and said, now we're going to organize ourselves. We're going to go through our demands. Bayard Rustin's going to read every demand, and we're going to call for your a commitment to fulfill those demands. So look at number 8, a national minimum wage act that will give all Americans a decent standard of living. Government surveys show that anything less than $2 an hour fails to do that. Okay, so right after this, 2 days after the march, the national minimum wage was raised to $1.25 an hour. Okay, and between 1963 and 1971, there were multiple times when it was raised to $1.60. So they were asking for $2. It was raised to $1.60, February 1971. Okay, the last time Congress has raised the minimum wage was 2007, and it was raised effective July 2009. What is the minimum wage today? $7.25. So I don't have the pink, those wonderful pink Post-its, but I want you to imagine a pink Post-it. If you go to the U.S. Department of Labor, there's a calculator. You could put in $2, August 1963. What would it take to get to $2 now to achieve the demands that were made in 1963? Any volunteers? $20. $20. And our minimum wage is $7.25. The March on Washington was a march for economic justice and for freedom and for a decent living wage for all Americans. And we have not achieved that. and we need to still fight for it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good morning. Thank you to Dr. Martin and to Jackie, everyone at the NLP Institute here at Stanford, who made our time together yesterday and today possible. As I've said to a few of the other panelists, I'm a law professor who finds myself and all of my scholarship on contemporary legal issues inextricably connected to American history. But I'm not a historian. We were in the car yesterday and I think Tom said, oh, I'm always intimidated when there are legal people who understand history. And I'm like, yeah, and as a law professor, I'm intimidated when there are historians. And I want to talk about history. But I definitely appreciate all of the brilliance that you all have contributed to the scholarship for the folk in the room today and others, because it does provide a solid foundation for my legal scholarship. And so without it, I would be a little bit lost and people would tell me I'm making it all up. I want to spend my time with you picking up maybe two threads that I think will be helpful to adding some layers to our discussions, particularly as it relates to King's and Lewis's calls for an end to police brutality during the remarks on at the March on Washington and beyond. As King said in his speech in 1963, that 1963 was not the end, that it was just the beginning. And in many ways, I see components of both men's speeches as a strategic approach to getting the nation's attention to the problem of police violence. We know that American policing has been and has always been pathologically brutal and violent against Black people long before the civil rights demonstrations began in the 50s and the 60s. And we know King's comment on the issue was broad. He answers his own question around when will civil rights leaders be satisfied, and he says we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. And I love, Jonathan, thank you so much for this, that you included a list of demands here, right? Because number 6 is about the authority of the Attorney General to institute injunctive suits where any constitutional right is violated, also very broad, but becomes instrumental here. And so perhaps an expansion on that and an expansion on Tom's remarks yesterday, John Lewis expressed great disappointment in the civil rights bill's failure to include Title III protections by way of authorizing the Attorney General to sue for police abuses. As King said, 1963 was not the end, it was only the beginning. It took 30 full years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed for something similar to Title III protections to be passed by Congress. Became what, that happened when they passed Section 14141. It's what we commonly call it. It's now codified as, I don't know why they changed it, but they codified it as a new statute, a new section 12601. I like 14141 better. But it finally authorized, right, the United States Attorney General to sue local and state police for a pattern or practice of constitutional violations. And this, of course, came about as in 1994, after the country grappled with the international embarrassment of Rodney King being brutally beaten on the Delaware highway, right, and captured by a home video recording, which is like really amazing to think about, right? Like that a home video recording actually existed. The guy had just got it, and just happened to be up and out and trying to figure out what all the fuss was about and managed to actually get it an image of it. The use of DOJ pattern or practice litigation as a means of federal intervention, right, and remedy from unconstitutional police abuses has largely been dependent on, of course, the presidential administration in office. And so the first wave of DOJ suits happened under the Clinton administration. And they're really, if you look at them, they're really short, short orders. Have very little comment around community and how to repair or how to build, I hate the word repair, how to build any trust between police and those impacted by police violence, largely Black and brown communities. And then, of course, when the Democrats are not in office, they drop off. And we see any investigation that had started under what I call the first wave turn into sort of like memorandums of understanding. No real teeth, right? And then we see them come back in a real way, maybe not, I shouldn't say come back, come into existence in their full force with the first term of Barack Obama. And you start to see community appear in spaces and places of the consent decrees in ways that we hadn't seen before. There are extensive attempts to, and it gets better in the second wave, his second term, but there are extensive attempts to try to incorporate some of the thoughts and the views of communities who've been impacted by police violence. But what you don't see at the table are those organizations that have been calling for an end to police brutality all along the way, some dating long before the March on Washington, right? And the Department of Justice makes a concerted effort to keep those individuals out the room, makes a concerted effort to keep those individuals out of the lawsuits. And they always succeed. They always succeed. What the litigation history shows us is that they always succeed. Only in one instance in the LAPD do community orgs get amicus standing, but they don't get full standing. This brings me to my second point. Who does get full standing to intervene in the lawsuits? Police unions. And they routinely get, especially during the second and the third waves of consent decrees, they routinely find a way to convince courts of their right to intervene because they, not the communities impacted, but they have a substantial interest, right, in the outcome in the litigation, in the ways in which they allege, right, and the DOJ also agrees, community does not. They have a protectable interest that the court needs to hear and can only hear from representatives of the union, but that DOJ is somehow a sufficient and adequate representative for community voice. Baffles my mind. We can talk about that at a different time. But understanding the history of the federal government and its treatment of Black people and what it took to get, right, the passage, 30 years after the March on Washington to get 1994 passed, I tell my friends at DOJ, the arrogance, right? The arrogance that you could speak for community. But how the unions have gotten to this place of intervention starts when, in the 1960s. And so after more than 40 years, there's the police associations, and I use the term union very loosely. And I'll tell you why. Police associations have existed since the late 1800s. They've existed as fraternal organizations, but they've also existed in a way that padded the coffers of those associations to lobby for the things that those associations have wanted, both at the local and at the state level. That's been happening since like 1894, as early as I can, right? But the government, both the local and the state and the federal governments had always resisted giving collective bargaining rights to police unions because they thought that it was undemocratic and they felt like public safety should trump any sort of attempts by these associations to negotiate about their wages, their hours, and their benefits. So much so, in Boston, there's this huge strike. The police act a complete fool. They all lose their jobs, right? And they don't get the right to collectively bargain in 1919. And then all of a sudden in 1960, as all of this is happening, what is also happening? States around the country, as Jean said yesterday, all over the North, meaning the East, the North, and the West, all over the North are passing collective bargaining statutes to authorize unions, right, to negotiate both on wages and hours, but then other conditions of employment. And in my scholarship, I talk about how those other conditions of employment allow the unions to get into the courtrooms to obstruct consent decrees. But at the time of the 1960s, as the right is being given across the country in states across the country, we see from 1960 to 1969, 14 states, boom, 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 quick successive order, passing collective bargaining statutes. And I know that as folks are, hindsight is 20/20, right? Hindsight is 20/20. I don't know if anyone was paying attention to the realities of what it meant for unions to get that collective bargaining authority. They were successful. The salary of police increased across the country in a 5-year period, mid-1960s, by 34%. But what they were also able to do, and that's fine, we just talked about $2 to $20, right? Like, I think people should earn a living wage. But what we don't talk about is how the unions at that time in 1960, 1963 specifically, especially in Rochester, New York, are working to obstruct one of the very things that Martin Luther King was advocating for, not mentioned explicitly during the March on Washington, but certainly a part of his local work as he traveled across the country, and that was community oversight. And the unions used their money, their political power, their influence on elected and appointed officials in such a way that allowed them to gut any efforts to establish community independent oversight of police practices. In northern cities where we know people were migrating, looking for jobs, looking for affordable housing, looking for, right, a way out of a lack of a future, right, that the South was presenting, fleeing from the violence and the terror, only to be encountered by the violence and the terror and the discrimination, right? And to have no place by which to lay their grievances with any confidence that it would be really considered. And so he's going around the country, he's in Rochester, he's in New York City, right? And he's saying these community oversight boards have to be established. And the unions are working extremely hard, both in the courts, outside of the courts, using their dollars with marketing, right? The NYPD, PBA, has an ad that runs, a full-page ad that runs in the New York Times. If I was sophisticated, I would have it on the slide. A full-page ad that runs in the New York Times as they're fighting the establishment of police review boards of a little white girl going into a subway tunnel, right? And it says something to the effect of, doesn't she deserve to be safe? Don't you deserve to be safe, right? Civilian review board must be stopped. And what did the voters do? They put a referendum on the ballot and the voters agreed that she has to be safe, right? And so I'm sure my time is up. My point in all of this is that 30 years after the passage, or 30 years after the March on Washington, we have the passage of the 1995, now infamous omnibus crime control bill that includes this section, this 14141 authorization, right? And now with 30 years now after, right, we're still dealing with consent decrees, but those consent decrees are often void of community voice, right? And often are afraid to deal with union power. And so there's still work to be done. You asked me to say where we are, right? 2023, after 60 years after the march, that's where we are in the area of policing. The federal government is not the sole answer, and if we rely on the federal government to be the sole answer, community voice will always be.
Thanks, Aisha and John. Starting off great with your remarks. Aisha, I'm really struck by, I'm writing a report on collective bargaining for police, accountability, and I actually never put together the connections. And of course in Minneapolis. As in St. Paul, I don't live in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's important if you know the local demographics and politics. But in Minneapolis, we're actually dealing with a consent decree that explicitly written into it says that nothing in the agreement can violate the police this collective bargaining contract. So yeah, that's really powerful. Lerone and Tanisha and Jackie and Eric, thanks for organizing this, and I'm really honored to be part of this conversation. I've learned a tremendous amount in the past day. So I want to talk about the meaning of the March on Washington. I think, obviously we are living in a horrific political period. Domestically, a period of dysfunctional politics, a loss of faith in democracy, internationally, a turn to violence instead of substantive political change. And I think in that context, this might come off as Pollyannish. I think the March on Washington matters because it worked. It was a massive, well-organized political protest that had a clear and significant impact on national politics and federal policy. And in the context that we're living today, I think we need more attention to how that happened. At the same time, I think it worked in ways that are very different from the ways in which we commonly understand the march to have worked. And I want to talk about three important corrections today. One is that it was not a one-day event, and in fact, it was the result of over 20 years of planning and organizing going back to the original March on Washington during the Second World War. It was rooted in long-standing institutions that were methodically built up over that time. The most important actually being, I think, Black women's organizations, the National Council of Negro Women, Black sororities, the YWCA. These were the largest and most consistent supporters of the March on Washington movement starting in the 1940s, consisting and going through the 1960s. It's also often forgotten, these were the largest Black organizations. The National Council of Negro Women had 800,000 members. The March on Washington was initiated by the Negro American Labor Council, another organization that's completely forgotten. If it's mentioned in the literature, it's dismissed as a paper organization. A. Philip Randolph who was the president of the NALC, is routinely described in the literature as the only major civil rights leader without an organization. The Negro American Labor Council was officially founded in 1960, so just before the march, but it was rooted in networks of Black trade unionists that went back to the 1930s and 40s, and in the case of A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, to the 1920s. It was led by A. Philip Randolph, but mostly organized and represented by younger Black trade unionists, mostly in the unions affiliated with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, It was a relatively small organization. It was an organization of leaders, roughly 1,500 members. But these were often people who were the presidents of their local trade unions. They were also often deacons in their churches. They were often presidents of local NAACP branches. So in this case, it was actually more similar to the SCLC than the NAACP. It was not a mass organization. It was an organization of leaders. It was a tremendously influential organization. And it was the organization that I discovered in my research really was primarily responsible for getting 250,000 people to Washington. It was also organized by, I think we should recognize two very different generations of civil rights organizations. The established ones, certainly the NAACP, slightly newer core, but also these newer organizations like the SCLC and SNCC that were found, forged in the more recent struggle in the more recent period. So I think we often, the sort of typical view of the March on Washington, it was a one-day event. Martin Luther King sent out a tweet, said, meet me at the Lincoln Memorial. That was not what happened. So secondly, the March on Washington worked not by moderating its demands and appealing to the center, but as Jonathan points out, by advancing a tremendously radical agenda that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. We have to remember that it took place in the context not just of the Cold War, but in the context of massive resistance against the civil rights movement. It also took place in the context of a rather moderate, liberal presidential administration. President Kennedy, before the march took place, proposed what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was focused very narrowly on Southern segregation. He adamantly insisted that it should not address the sort of national issues of racial inequality that Jean talked about yesterday. And these, the march had two really central goals. One was to pass Kennedy's bill. That would become important. There was dissent among the organizers of this. SNCC, for example, wanted to dismiss Kennedy's bill, and the primary organizers insisted that that had to be part of the agenda. But more importantly, the agenda was to go beyond that and expand the bill. To add a Fair Employment Practices Law, which was the demand of the original March on Washington in 1941, to push for a federal jobs creation program. Jonathan has provided us with the full text of the demands to create meaningful and dignified jobs for all workers who wanted them, to raise the minimum wage to what today would be $20 an hour, and importantly, to extend the minimum wage to all workers. Significant portions of Black workers have been exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act, which sets the minimum wage, and that would become really critical in the decade following the march. None of these things were supported by the Kennedy administration. And importantly, the purpose of the march was to push the administration on this. Journalist Harvey Swados described the march as surpassing anything conceived of by white liberals and well-intentioned officialdom. After watching Bayard Rustin read the full text of the demands, while, quote, every television camera at the disposal of the networks was upon him, journalist Murray Kempton remarked, "No expression 1/10 so radical has ever been seen or heard by so many Americans." Tom helpfully showed us John Lewis's speech. I mean, this is a tremendously radical statement. A. Philip Randolph's speech, the opening remarks of the March on Washington, Jonathan pointed to them. That passage ends with him saying, "We need to assert that the sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of the human personality." And then he goes on to explain that this is why Black people are at the forefront of this revolution. He says, because we have been turned from human personalities into private property, right? Framing the march in the context of this century-long struggle for human freedom. So it's remarkable the amount of ink that has been spilled talking about the March on Washington being this sort of moderate event, going back to Malcolm X's comments, right? There's nothing that could be farther from the truth. So that's the second reason I think we need to know about it today. Third is understanding what the march accomplished. I think we see this often. The march is seen as this sort of magical shift in public opinion. People hear the "I have a dream" speech, they realize Black people have gotten the a short end of the stick, and white America sort of apologizes, right? Again, could not be farther from the truth. In fact, I think it's clear that if we look at the behavior and public opinion polling, opposition continued and even grew more violent in the context. We know this from the Birmingham bombing. We know this from the stories of people returning from the march who were physically attacked. We know this, as Jean pointed out, from the rise of mass movements in northern cities against open housing in the wake of the march, right? So that was not what happened. People didn't wake up and suddenly realize they had been wrong. What the march did was it solidified a political coalition with the power to pass federal legislation. Most importantly, I think, in this was the backing of organized labor. The AFL-CIO did not back the March on Washington. Historian Philip Foner observed that the march was probably the biggest march of union members in American history. This was embarrassing for white union leadership, that they had not endorsed the largest march of union members in US history. They came on board after the march. They backed Kennedy's bill with the additions. They pushed Johnson to pass the War on Poverty, to raise the minimum wage several times, and to extend it significantly to hospital workers and other public employees. They passed the voting rights, they backed passing the voting rights bills and the open housing law. Not all of the demands of the March on Washington, of course, were accomplished, but many of them were in significant ways. And I think there's an important, we need to understand the ways in which things were not accomplished, but then ways in which things were accomplished and then pushed back, right? So on the minimum wage, for example, by the early 1970s, the minimum wage was more valuable than it ever had been or would be in American history, right? And then we see it pushed back. I guess I would just in wrapping up, I think it's, I'm not a Pollyanna about this, and certainly the March on Washington was not perfect. I think I would point most importantly to the fact that it was deeply marred by sexism. But this outcome, I think, was also surprising and important. Black women emerged from the march emboldened and determined not to allow that type of thing to happen. The fact that they basically played the most important role in organizing the march and were not allowed to be official spokespeople at the march. Pauli Murray, who organized the first March on Washington during the Second World War, was probably the most important figure in bringing Gandhian nonviolence into that movement back in the 1940s. She worked to ensure that gender discrimination would be added to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Title VII is the FEPC law, the Fair Employment Practices Law, that was the central demand of the 1940 march. She ensured that that would be expanded to include sex discrimination as well as racial discrimination and religious and national origin. Dorothy Height said that, quote, "Black women would no longer postpone or subordinate the fight against discrimination because of sex to the civil rights struggle, but must carry on both fights simultaneously," right? And this becomes really a very clear political objective in response to the sexism of the march. So Black women were the earliest and most consistent supporters of the March on Washington, and they took its meaning farther than any of the participants. So I mean, I think the March on Washington today serves as a model for political organizing and change, you know, with its inconsistencies and its imperfections. But I think it's actually the way in which we often remember it is exactly the opposite of that. It's sort of, you know, we've been talking about King's image being defanged. We think of it as this moderate march that sort of happened suddenly without any organizing, and often an event that actually did not have an impact. In all three of those respects. Remember that today. So thank you very much.
So I will take convener's privilege, and I would love to start us off with two questions. So first, Aisha, I'm thinking of you, but also Lita and others we have in the room who are connected with Stanford Law, Jory as well. I'm curious about, in light of what you laid out for us, but we know that in many of these communities, it's taxpayers who end up bailing out police officers who are behaving aggressively, assaulting people. How does it work out in the courtroom when communities are paying millions of dollars? Ferguson, St. Louis, Baltimore, the list goes on.
Cleveland.
Cleveland, thank you. Shout out to the Cleveland people in the house. How does it still make sense in the courtroom that these communities do not have standing, or do you get the question I'm asking? All right, and the second question is, because we got so many people from Ohio in the house, help us, William, connect, I think, the UAW, Walter Reuther being at the March on Washington, and then the UAW strikes that are happening right now in Ohio and Michigan. You could help us think that through. So those are two questions I have. Start us off. So Aisha, start, please, if you would, and then some of the other folks who have
The first thing I would say is that the courts are obviously complicit in not just in 14141 civil injunctive litigation, right, but also in 1983 excessive use of force litigation as well. And I say the latter because of the creation of this qualified immunity, right? That allows individual officers to not be held accountable for their behavior, right? And their misconduct. And at the same time, right, where jurisdictions who haven't bothered to rein in problem officers or problematic practices seem to have made, I won't say seem to have made a calculated decision, right, that they'd rather just roll the dice, right, in federal court on those 1983 suits and see how big of a judgment they would have to pay. Since Mike Brown, right, I will say, right, the cost of those things have gone up, right, and they are not willing to roll the dice in front of a jury, right? But nonetheless, we see this calculated decision. Shout out to Cleveland, right? The Cleveland, it's no secret, it's national news, so I'm not divulging anything that's protected here, right? The city of Cleveland decided to pay for the officers who weren't protected by qualified immunity or facing, decided that they would pay for them to file bankruptcy. Right, provide them counsel for filing bankruptcy in order to limit their personal liability, while also, right? And so the ways in which elected and appointed officials, judicial, right, officials, and the like are all sort of, and maybe I am a conspiracy theorist, but I don't have to be one for the evidence here to bear this out, right? Right. There's a concerted effort to keep both community out of the space of the civil injunctive litigation, right? But also to keep individuals from having their day in court in such a way that really changes the calculus for those in charge of policing. And so I think both things are happening at the same time. Yeah.
Please go.
Yeah, my name is Graham. I'm actually at the Stanford Law School to run the negotiation mediation program. I was actually in DOJ during the Obama years, so I may have to talk to Yisha a bit about that, but I claim some Ohio State cred, so I hope that helps. But
And that does too, so you're in good company.
you know, one thing when you talk about the millions that cities pay, it comes out of the city budget, not out of the police budget. They don't ever care.
Well, I
Right.
mean, okay, that's a fair point, but it's all the same budget to LaRone's, right? I mean, there is no police budget without a city budget.
But you're
Right.
saying police are not hurt.
They're not hurt, so they're not taking more responsibility.
Right, it's not reducing, it's not like, well, we had to pay $5 million, we had to pay $6 million for Tamir, right? We're gonna reduce next year's budget for the $6 million, yeah, they don't have that consequence for sure.
And I think it would make a difference.
Right, I just want to briefly follow up because in 1963, somehow that we've referred to Burt Marshall coming in from the Justice Department to Birmingham, and he negotiated with Clarence Jones and Andy Young. And after that, they put into the 1964 Civil Rights Act a provision to create a federal agency called the Community Relations Service to have an agency that would deal with these kinds of disputed problems in communities. And Grant Lum is here. He actually was the head of that service during the Obama years and was dealing with these community, with all of these consent decrees and trying to negotiate them on behalf of the federal government. So I don't know if there's any.
It was meant to uplift the community voices, you know, in these situations, but there's huge challenges, as you point out.
Yeah, no, I guess I should have said the arrogance to you in the corner, no.
Other comments about that question before we move on to the UAW? Thank you, please.
Yeah.
Start us off.
I mean, actually, I think that it's actually related in the way in which, I think the thing that it's important to remember that the expansion of collective bargaining rights in the 1960s and 1970s for public employees was actually not in any way really significantly at all pushed for by police unions. It was pushed by unions of Black, low-wage public employees. I mean, you know, from King's story, we would know about the sanitation workers, but, you know, all over the country, there was organization, you know, primarily pushing for these. I mean, it's this sort of ironic, it's just tragic outcome is that police are the biggest beneficiaries of that, right? And they're the ones in the strongest position. In some ways, they don't push for it because they already have a lot of clout, and they don't really need it in the way that sanitation workers and hospital workers and janitorial workers really need it. So I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about organized labor, you know, it's this huge and varied institution that includes, you know, as Dr. King said, you know, Black people are primarily working people, right? And these institutions, for all their problems, are also one of the most important vehicles for empowerment for Black workers. And in that way, I think, you know, we can see Walter Reuther's role in the march in a similar role. I think, you know, he was there because one of the founding institutions of the Negro American Labor Council, the Trade Union Leadership Conference, which was Black trade unionists in Detroit, primarily within the UAW. They were primary organizers of the march. But from the point of view of local politics, Walter Reuther couldn't have not been there, right? I mean, it was and so they were pushing him in the same way that I think you understand this evolving movement for pushing for bargaining rights in cities. This is part of the movement. It's a really effective part of it. I would just say that I think, within the UAW, I think what's interesting about the strike now is that it, in many respects, is a result of the reform movement again within the UAW. The UAW has been plagued by corruption and sort of passivity, and also largely rooted in Detroit. There's a reform movement that's that helped to elect Sean Fain as the president, and and he came in with a dedication to taking on a much more militant position. The strike's a result of that.
The only other thing I was gonna add is I should have given my disclaimer that I had to give a colleague around like my attack of police unions not being undemocratic and not being anti-labor. But I'm sure everybody in the room understands that. The other thing though, that even the historians who are writing about and the legal scholars and policing scholars who are writing about the rise of unions in the 60s and the late 60s, early 70s, they're acknowledging that they're taking a play out of organized labor, of course, but also out of the Black liberation movement, right? And so you see officers unionize, right, in these police associations, framing themselves as having personal autonomy in much of the same way that the Black liberation folks were, right? As not their profession, but their personal identity to promote their cause, right, for collective bargaining and support, public support. Yeah.
Jory, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I wanted to ask a question. I really appreciate you bringing up the role of women in this whole story. And one of the things that is really interesting to me about labor and currently, I mean, there's so much happening in the labor movement now, but there are so many jobs that are traditionally women of color and immigrants of color, like nannies and all these other things that are explicitly excluded from the laws around labor. And I'm curious if any of you know if there's a movement towards including these different categories of work. I've heard a little bit about it, but I'm just curious about that because it seems like that would fundamentally restructure poverty lines if women who are working in these areas now have a minimum wage, even if it's appalling as it is, Jonathan. But it just seems like it could reshape American life in a significant way, and I'm wondering if thoughts about that.
I mean, I think reflective of that, the president of the AFL-CIO is a woman for the first time. The president of all the biggest labor unions are women, and they're unions that they're unions that represent healthcare workers and teachers and traditionally female occupations that have really transformed the union movement in a profound way.
Yes, I was just talking about the specific, like there are some jobs that are excluded from those, like so teachers are, but early child care or early childhood workers, child care centers, they're not, or a nanny is not, or a housekeeper in a person's home. They're all specifically excluded from those federal laws. So clearly the teachers unions are very powerful and have done amazing work. But I was thinking about job categories that have been excluded from those labor protections, and if there's any movement towards including them and what that would look like, because that seems like it would be fairly transformative.
It would be, yeah, that's true. I mean, I think the best example of movement sort of changing that is around home healthcare workers. And that's largely taken place at the state level. It's but
California.
Right. So getting home healthcare workers. There's, I guess, didn't the governor veto a bill around domestic work?
So I don't think he's dealt yet with the healthcare.
Right. But I think there's something about protecting domestic workers that I think Newsom recently vetoed, but I don't know the details. But I think those issues are really important. I mean, they're sort of largely at the state level, because there's been the idea of passing federal labor law reform right now is hard to imagine. So
Congress is gonna solve that problem.
I know. Yeah, so.
I'd like to say a few comments about several things that have been said. So William emphasized that this number 9 of the demands was very deliberately focused on this, on Tori's issue, which is we demand that we expand the Fair Labor Standards Act to include all areas of employment which are personally excluded. And I'm not a historian of this, but there's been significant expansion, and there still are significant areas that are excluded. And I think domestic workers is one of the
Domestic workers
areas
and
of
farm workers.
and farm
I
work.
mean, California farm workers are included in the state law, but
Okay.
yeah, but in most states they're not.
This is still a huge battle, but there's some amazing organizers in this front right now, you know, that we can support. And then I want to say a couple of things with regard to police brutality generally, and I didn't have time for the pictures, but ending police brutality is not on this list. I'm not sure why, because, you know, Bayard Rustin fiercely controlled the messaging, and, you know, they were given instructions. Here are the signs you can hold. You're not allowed to sign and hold any other sign. There were like a sign for each of these, but there was a sign and police brutality, and of course that was a big theme, as you were saying, of King's remarks. So it was very much on people's minds, and obviously coming out of Birmingham, but much more than that. And then one last thing I want to say about Walter Reuther, and I mentioned this to Jonathan yesterday. So Dr. Jones still carries with him, I think, maybe the number one feeling of regret that he has was the following year in Atlantic City, when King had this impossible dilemma. You know, should we go with Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses, or should we go with LBJ? And the key, I think Clarence has told me that Walter Reuther was the key person in that decision. And, you know, basically we can't, you know, the argument was LBJ is gonna lose if we abandon the Democrats now, when we're gonna get a fascist leader. Fascist was the word that was used by Dr. King a few months later at the Nobel Prize thing, and Clarence talked with him about that word. And so they said, we just can't afford to jeopardize the election. So Clarence had to tell Fannie Lou Hamer, we're gonna accept the deal with only 2 members of the Mississippi Freedom, but it still weighs on him because it was so wrong. But it's an impossible dilemma.
Thank you so much for the point on the category of workers. I think a lot about home health care workers. I've thought about them but I thought about them largely in the context of non-compete agreements and the way in which they've been used against home health care workers to stop them from finding better and more suitable employment. We know that there's a push during the Biden administration in the last year, maybe 18 months, to get rid of all non-competes, and that some of the directives on that has been down back. But I love the idea of thinking about sort of, as a legal scholar, I get to not worry about what Congress will do. Right? Or you could just talk about it as what would be the right thing to do.
What they should do.
And so the aspiration of that is a really, really powerful thought. So thank you on that. The other thing on the who's missing from the speeches, so part of what I didn't say was that in the proximity and sort of advocacy around those proximate to police brutality, right? I noted that in the conversation, John Lewis's remarks around Americus, right? The stolen girls aren't mentioned at all, right? The stolen girls aren't mentioned at all. And those are the young people who have been protesting, school age 12 to, I think they said they're 12 to 15-year-olds, maybe up to 32 of them, 33 of them, who over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks were imprisoned, were jailed because and because of the overflow pushed to the Leesburg stockade, right? And just really, really intriguing to me, right? That even in this space, is he's calling out the 3 SNCC workers, not the 2 locals, one of which was a woman, but then there's all of these young women, these young teenage girls, not even women, right? Who are being held in deplorable conditions in this pre-Civil War stockade, right?
I do think that, I think the reason that John Lewis is pointing to the Americas for and not the Leesburg girls is because they're very upset about the use of the Reconstruction,
Yeah, right.
and like appealing to like a federal.
That's right, that makes sense. And it worked, it was a good strategic decision, right?
They were charged with insurrection, which was the death penalty.
Right, it's a good strategic decision, right? And at the same time, I still worry about being proximate to, right? Yeah.
Just to piggyback on that, you write about how Danny Lyons worked his way in there, and that kind of reinforces one of my points about the forging of independent channels of communication within the movement.
Oh, those girls.
Yeah.
I also want to, I'm really glad William highlighted this issue, Jory. If you look at the program, you know, they didn't give a major speaking slot to any woman, which is incredibly bad. So, you know, I don't know the dynamics, and you may know about it, William, but, you know, Rosa Parks and other, these incredible leaders said, hey, this is not right. So they put them in, it's like, oh, we'll tribute to women. So they had, you know, some little part in it where we'll give a tribute to women. So, and I do think it afterwards really mobilized, you know, saying this is not tolerable.
Yeah.
Dorothy Height's autobiography really goes into
Yeah, she really writes.
So does Hannah Hedgeman and
Yeah, I mean, it was really.
They had a meeting with Coretta King in November of all the disgruntled women. It's like, what do we do now?
John Marcel writes the thing that Daisy Bates says that she doesn't even get to, you know, Daisy Bates gives the 3-minute tribute to women, his Merle Evers isn't there, but John Marcel writes it for her. She doesn't even get to say her own words, and it's really weird if you listen to it. It's basically a pledge by women to support the movement, but
We stand by our men.
exactly.
Great presentations. I wanted to underscore, though, that March was different things to different people because it was a coalition and they extracted and brought different meanings and understandings to it. There is a counter narrative coming from the left within SNCC. You can see it in Michael Thelwell, you can see it in James Foreman's autobiography, and some of the news coverage at the time. And the narrative goes that the March on Washington was originally going to be massive civil disobedience in the event of a filibuster, but that the moderates bargained that away and it became a pass the Kennedy bill march. But even Thelwell says he came out of it sort of inspired. But there's a sort of allegation, I've heard it from historians, that the March on Washington just psyched off local energies, that it took away from the local organizing and the local movements. And they were trying to explain why after the march in October and November, there wasn't the momentum of the summer, right? So you got to sort of put that against the narrative that will really this galvanized a national coalition. But even Alice Walker in her memoir talks about hearing King said, go back to the South and fight for justice. And she said, I never heard anybody tell me to go back to the South. And she did. She went back to Meridian, Mississippi. So, you know, there is a debate about this. The other thing that's kind of left out is the churches, National Council of Churches, and, you know, the synagogues. And they came in with more moderate demands. AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, wanted them to take out the $2 minimum wage because they didn't agree to that. And so Rustin kind of maneuvered his way around. That's why he says it's the government that says this is a decent standard of living. But I don't think it can be minimized because they moderate the march, but they're also crucial to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the recruitment of Midwestern Republicans. And that's what John Kennedy is really trying to get them to commit themselves to, right after. So.
Yeah, there's this funny footnote about the minimum wage demand. Support of the march does not necessarily indicate endorsement of every demand listed.
Yeah, that's Barbara Moffat of AFSC said, we're not going to come if you leave this in. And Barry Rustin wrote back and said, okay, we'll take it out. But he didn't. He put it in another form.
But I think that's part of the reason for the march's success. It was a coalition that, of course, people made compromises, and that's an effective political movement.
Yeah, Randolph said, the power of our numbers speaks, and they really were going after numbers.
So, I think that's very important. Personally, one of the themes that's coming out of this discussion, and everyone's been emphasizing, is there's a lot to learn in terms of tactics, organization, strategy, for us to be effective with protest. And I believe, this is true of this, but also Selma and other major campaigns, the interfaith alliances, very important. And in this, National Council of Churches is very important. And obviously, both Black churches throughout, who had been having mass meetings for years, and churches that were national, that were new to came together. But Archbishop O'Boyle really put this to the test, because they wanted the Archbishop of Washington, and he said, I'm not going to do it if John Lewis says these certain things. So Bayard Rustin sat down with John Lewis, you're going to have to compromise. And Lewis said, no, I'm not going to. And Rustin, mediated that. And, you can go back and see the original. As you know, Lewis's talk is already fiery and powerful, but it was more so. And there was lines about marching through the South like Sherman, So they took out some of it in order to come up, to keep O'Boyle.
I don't think it was completely O'Boyle. The two things that Lewis changed was he got rid of references to violence.
Yes.
That was Rustin. Right. And he said, we will support the bill. We will support Kennedy's bill with grave reservations, right? And that, I think, also was Rustin. They were adamant that this was not going to dismiss the bill, but that it was going to change the bill. So I think in Lewis's autobiography, he portrays, I think, Randolph and Rustin as pretty dismissive of Boyle, right? Saying, they were objecting to him talking about a revolution, and Randolph was there. He started the march by his speech talked about it being a revolution.
Thank you for that correction. That makes a lot of sense.
But there's a change in Randolph's rhetoric from March until August, and that moral revolution is it's kind of a sandwiching and a concession to the religious folks. So there is this sort of interplay.
Yeah, with the religious groups, I think this is another case for Anna Hedgeman. Anna Arnold Hedgeman. And she's the only woman on the organizing committee of the march. She's the one who says repeatedly, Dorothy Height needs to be one of the main speakers. She's the one who really puts together the coalition of religious organizations. And it's reflective again of this, these grassroots networks of Black women, rooted in organizations like the YWCA and in churches that really make the march successful.
Let me jump in. We have Jean, who's about to go back to New York, and then we'll go to Adam, and then we'll break.
So this point you're making about the ways that police unions are taking the language of the Black freedom struggle would just help me kind of crystallize. So in 1964, King gets sued by the officer Gilligan, right, who kills Jimmy Powell and in Harlem for $1.5 million. But the language in the suit and then the language that as it's being covered is all about, right, the harm to his person, right? And the harm to his reputation and what it means and how, basically like it's mean that he was called a murderer, even though he killed Jimmy Powell, right? But it's interesting, like, it just made me think what your point about like how they're taking the language, like, of the Black freedom struggle to basically make this, I mean, it's a nuisance suit, right? But it gets a lot of coverage. I mean, because.
And I missed it in my last article. Thanks, Jane.
I can. Yeah. So, but,
Thank you for that.
yeah, I
It'll
can.
be good for the next project.
Adam, please.
Sorry to lean on some hometown privilege, Aisha, but this is really open for anybody. What does a path forward for meaningful civilian oversight look like in policing when, first of all, given all the structural things that have been talked about today, and even explicit documentation of police alignment with white supremacist groups is not enough, right, to make a ripple in the conversation when elected civilian leaders don't have enough power to do anything meaningful, even if they want to. I mentioned hometown privilege here because going back, 30 plus years, Mike White, when he was mayor in Cleveland, at least made an attempt to uncover and do something about police involvement in white supremacist organizations, and that went nowhere, right? So to bring it back around, is there a meaningful way forward for meaningful civilian oversight?
Yeah. We had a little bit of this conversation, I feel like yesterday, and I think my response is, this is something I've been chewing on quite a bit because we've seen with the passage of issue 24 back home, right, in Chicago, they passed the mayor created compromise, the former mayor created a compromise for there to be elected officials who are appointed, and then she has to they have to write opinions around why they choose to not follow the oversight board's direction. I would just say that as long as the structure is focused on evaluating police conduct through the lens that internal administrative structures do, we're gonna see the same outcomes, right? Meaning that if the policy that the officers are being held accountable for misses the issues and the concerns that impact community in such a way that breed mistrust and lack of accountability and untruthfulness and all of those pieces and parts, right? You're never gonna get at the heart of what's really wrong here. And so community oversight built on the model of internal affairs review is gonna get you the same result, right, as internal affairs reviews will. That's the first thing. The other thing I think that's really, really problematic or troubling is that the folks who come to the space wanting to do community oversight really want to do it and do it well. There's a sense of obligation and ownership. And the power structure that exists outside of the work that they're doing only serves so you talk about Mike White, right? I don't know if you looked at Cleveland.com, but our current mayor just gave them a raise, like crazy raise.
I did see that, yes.
In exchange for nothing, and with management rights on the table, right? And so there's this political, which is unheard of.
Which is why I said even if they're getting
right, it's unheard of that you would give away management rights, right? And they're doing it in exchange for nothing.
At all.
Right? And under a consent decree, which is a whole nother topic. So I just think that there are a lot of realities that are in play that serve to frustrate really what true accountability can look like. And I appreciate the question because I'm always percolating on even what does that mean? Exactly. What does true accountability mean? And how do we get there?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
We'll break now. We will be back here at 1 in this room to close out with our discussion of Birmingham. So I want to thank all our presenters for their wonderful, thoughtful